Doctors wanted to amputate his leg. He won 5 world championships anyway. In 1992, Mick Doohan crashed at nearly 200 miles per hour. The injury destroyed his right leg. Surgeons said amputation was the only option. He refused. He had a friend drain the wound daily just to keep riding. He retrained his entire braking system around a thumb brake because his foot no longer worked. And then he went on an unbroken 5-year championship run that most engineers still struggle to explain. In the next 20 minutes, you'll see exactly how he rebuilt himself and the machine. Mick Doohan came back, not once. Not in the way that we usually mean when we say someone came back from something difficult. He came back from something that the doctors who treated him described carefully and professionally as career-ending. He came back from something that required a medical decision so significant that his team manager had to be involved in making it. He came back from a leg that was, by the time the surgeons had done what they could do, a fundamentally different structure than the leg he had been born with. And then he won 5 consecutive world championships. The story of Mick Doohan is not a story about talent, although he had talent in quantities that most people who watched him race found genuinely difficult to process. It is not a story about machinery, although the Honda NSR 500 that he spent the best years of his career aboard was one of the most extraordinary and terrifying racing motorcycles ever built. It is a story about something harder to define and harder to manufacture than talent or machinery. It is a story about a particular quality of will that exists in very few people, and that, when you encounter it in the right context, produces outcomes that seem to contradict the normal rules of how things work. Michael Sidney Doohan was born in 1965 in Brisbane, Australia, in a country that has produced motorcycle racers with a consistency that is difficult to explain and easy to admire. There is something about the Australian relationship with speed and risk that has, over the decades, generated a remarkable number of people willing to sit on 2 wheels at velocities that make everyone watching quietly nervous. Doohan was among the most serious of a serious generation. He came up through the domestic racing scene with the kind of methodical aggression that attracts attention without immediately announcing itself as extraordinary. He was fast, he was consistent, he was, from early in his career, notably difficult to intimidate. He made his Grand Prix debut in the late 1980s and by 1990 was racing for Honda in the premier 500cc class. The 500cc class, for those who came to motorcycle racing after its retirement, was the pinnacle of the sport for over half a century. It was not the class that exists today. The machines were 2-stroke, producing somewhere between 180 and 200 horsepower in a package that weighed less than 130 kilograms. The power delivery was savage, sudden, and completely indifferent to whether the person on the back of the machine was ready for it or not. Riders who survived long careers in the 500T class shared certain qualities: exceptional reflexes, physical courage, and a particular capacity for managing fear that most human beings never develop because most human beings never need it. Doohan, from his first seasons in the class, demonstrated that he had these qualities in abundance. By 1992, he was one of the fastest men in the world on a motorcycle. He had been fighting for the championship through the season with a focus and an intensity that his competitors found, depending on their temperament, either inspiring or deeply uncomfortable. He was not a racer who gave much away in conversation, in interviews, or in the paddock. He was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are concentrating on something that requires their complete attention. The championship was close. The next race was always the one that mattered most. Then came Assen. The Dutch TT at Assen has a particular place in motorcycle racing history. It is one of the oldest circuits on the Grand Prix calendar, with a history that stretches back to the earliest days of organized racing, and it has produced some of the sport's most extraordinary moments. It has also produced some of its darkest ones. In 1992, Mick Doohan's Dutch TT produced something that fell into the second category. In practice, Doohan crashed. The details of the crash itself are almost beside the point at this distance. What matters is what the crash left behind. His right leg was severely injured, the kind of injury that generates a specific and very unpleasant medical vocabulary involving words like compartment syndrome, which describes a condition where the pressure inside a muscle compartment builds to a level that begins to destroy the tissue inside it. If compartment syndrome is not treated quickly enough, the result is the loss of the limb. In some cases, even with treatment, the damage is permanent and severe. Doohan received treatment, but the treatment he received in the immediate aftermath of the crash was not adequate for the severity of what had happened. By the time the full extent of the injury was understood, the damage to his leg was serious enough that a genuine medical conversation had taken place about whether amputation was the appropriate course of action. That conversation was not hypothetical. It was a real consideration made by real doctors about a real man's real limb. He refused. The word refused is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I want to be precise about what it means in this context. It does not mean that Doohan was medically uninformed or that he didn't understand the risks of the decision he was making. It means that he understood the risks, understood the alternatives, and chose to keep the leg, knowing that the leg he would be left with would not be the leg he'd had before, knowing that the recovery would be long and painful and uncertain, knowing that the outcome of that recovery, in terms of what he would be able to do with it, was genuinely unclear. He kept the leg. And then he began, with the same systematic, undemonstrative intensity that characterized everything he did on a motorcycle, to find out what he could make of the situation. The recovery was not clean. It was not the kind of athletic comeback story where the numbers go in one direction and eventually the person returns to where they were before. The leg did not fully recover. It would never fully recover. Doohan lost significant function in his right foot, the foot that on a motorcycle operates the rear brake. For a 500 Grand Prix rider, the rear brake is not a small thing. It is a tool that experienced riders use with enormous precision during corner entry, as part of a complex physical conversation with the machine about where the weight is going and how fast the tires are being asked to work. Doohan could not use the rear brake in the way he had used it before, so he stopped using it. Instead, working with Honda's engineers, he had a thumb brake installed on the right handlebar, a lever operated by his thumb that allowed him to apply the rear brake without using his right foot at all. It was not a small modification. It required him to completely relearn a physical skill that he had spent years developing to the level of unconscious automatic response. It required him to reroute, through practice and repetition and enormous concentration, a set of physical habits that were as deeply embedded in his nervous system as any trained reflex can be. He did this while his leg was still recovering. He did this while the outcome of that recovery was still uncertain. And when he came back to the 500c Grand Prix circuit in 1993, he was not a diminished version of the rider he had been before. He was something more difficult to explain than that. The 1993 season was not Doohan's best. He was managing a body that had been through something significant, on a machine that was still one of the most demanding vehicles a human being could sit on, against competitors who were among the most talented and dangerous racers in the world. Kevin Schwantz, who that year won the championship that Doohan had been fighting for in 1992, was a rider whose natural speed was so exceptional that his performances occasionally appeared to have a different quality than the racing happening around him. Rainey, before the crash at Misano that ended his career, was systematic and intelligent and relentlessly quick. Doohan, returning from something that would have permanently ended the careers of most people who had experienced it, competed at a level that confirmed, beyond any reasonable question, that whatever the crash had taken from him, it had not taken the core of what made him fast. And then, beginning in 1994, the conversation changed entirely. The 1994 World Championship was Mick Doohan's, and the 1995 Championship, and 1996, and 1997, and 1998. 5 consecutive World Championships in the 500c class is a number that requires some context to fully appreciate. The 500c class was not a competition where dominance came easily. The machines were not stable or forgiving. The circuits of the 1990s combined the old and the new in ways that created specific and serious hazards. The riders competing against Doohan were, in any objective assessment, among the best motorcycle racers in the world during that period, men whose talent in any other era might have defined the championship entirely. During those 5 years, they defined second place. What Doohan brought to the 500c class during his period of dominance was something that went beyond the natural speed he had always possessed. It was a completeness, a capacity to be fast on any circuit, in any conditions, on tires that were working or tires that were not working, in races that were going according to plan, and in races that had required immediate and significant improvisation. The consistent thing about his championship years was not that the races were easy. It was that they were difficult in the ways that racing is always difficult, and that the difficulty did not change the outcome. His relationship with the Honda NSR 500 during these years was one of the most productive partnerships between a rider and a machine in the history of the sport. The NSR 500 was not, by general consensus, a motorcycle that rewarded riders who needed reassurance. It was capable, and it was fast, and it was also, in certain conditions and at certain points in the power delivery, an entity that required its rider to be in command of the situation, or accept the consequences of not being so. Doohan was in command of it in a way that, to outside observers, appeared almost uncanny. Riders who tested the same machinery in the same conditions described it as challenging. In Doohan's hands, in race conditions, it looked like something else entirely. There is a clip of footage from the mid-1990s that people who follow the technical side of motorcycle racing return to with some regularity. It shows Doohan exiting a corner on the NSR 500. And what the footage captures is the rear of the motorcycle stepping out in a way that, on any other rider in any other context, would require a correction, a physical response to a physical event. Doohan's correction is so small and so smooth and so perfectly proportioned to what the machine is doing that it is almost impossible to identify where the problem began and where the response ended. The machine misbehaves. The rider absorbs it. The lap continues. It looks, from the outside, like nothing happened. It looks that way because nothing happened. He made certain that nothing happened. That is a skill. It is a skill that is developed over years and thousands of miles, and an accumulation of physical experience that builds a set of responses so rapid and so precise that the conscious mind is not involved in their execution. Every serious racing motorcycle rider has some version of this skill. Doohan had it at a level that made the comparison with his peers somewhat uncomfortable for the peers. He was not universally beloved in the paddock. This is worth mentioning because the hagiography of dominant champions tends to sand off the edges that made them what they were, and Doohan's edges were genuine. He was not warm in the way that some racers are warm. He did not give much to the press, to his competitors, or to the commercial apparatus of the sport that wanted access to his personality as part of the product they were selling. He was there to race. The racing was the point. Everything else was a cost he paid in order to be there. This quality, the absolute prioritization of the thing itself over the performance of doing the thing, is not common even among people who reach the top level of any competitive endeavor. Most people, even very good ones, have a relationship with the audience around them that affects how they operate. The approval of observers changes something, however slightly. Doohan seemed genuinely indifferent to the approval of observers in a way that was either deeply admirable or slightly unsettling depending on where you were standing. His teammates and the technical staff at Honda, who saw him working rather than competing, told a different story. The Doohan, who existed in the garage, going through data and working with engineers on setup and asking the precise questions that led to the precise adjustments that translated into lap times, was meticulous and collaborative and demanding in the ways that good engineers are also demanding. He knew what he needed the machine to do. He had the technical language to describe what it was doing instead. And he had the patience to work through the gap between those two things until it closed. The 1999 season should have been the sixth championship. Doohan was leading the championship when, in the second race of the year at Jerez in Spain, he crashed heavily in qualifying. The injuries this time were to his right wrist and arm. He tried to continue. He rode 2 more races, managing a body that was not in a condition that any sensible person would have considered adequate for racing a 500c Grand Prix motorcycle. He finished in positions that, given what he was dealing with, were extraordinary. And then the accumulated reality of what his body had been through in 1992 and in everything that had followed, and now in 1999, became something that the season could not continue through. He retired. Not with a great ceremony, not with the extended farewell tour that some champions arrange for themselves in the final chapter of their careers, accumulating acknowledgement over a scheduled series of last appearances. He retired in the manner he had done almost everything else in his career, practically without decoration and on his own terms. The season was not going to be what it needed to be. He was not going to be able to give the racing what he had always given the racing. So he stopped. The championship that year went to Alex Crivillé, the Spaniard who had been competing in the shadow of Doohan's dominance for years and who, in the season that Doohan could not complete, demonstrated that the talent had always been there waiting for the space to occupy. Mick Doohan retired with 5 World Championships, 54 Grand Prix victories, and a physical record that most people in most professions would have found disqualifying before any of those numbers were accumulated. The leg that doctors had considered amputating was still with him. The thumb brake that Honda had built to his specification, the modification that represented the most practical and unromantic possible response to a situation that could have ended everything, had become part of the vocabulary of motorcycle racing. Other riders, facing their own physical challenges, looked at what Doohan had done and understood that the problem was a category of problem that had a solution if you were willing to find it. What do you do with a story like this? It doesn't have the shape that sporting stories are supposed to have. There is no antagonist who gets defeated, no rival who pushed him to be better, no moment where the doubt was overcome by the belief. The doubt, if it existed, was never visible. The process of getting from the hospital bed to the start line, and then from the start line to 5 championships, is, in the way Doohan has ever talked about it, a series of practical decisions. You assess what you have. You identify what needs to change. You make the changes. You compete. But the practicality is, in its own way, the most extraordinary part of the story. Because what Doohan was being practical about was a situation that most people, most athletes, most competitors, most human beings confronted with the information that their body had been fundamentally altered by something outside their control, would have processed emotionally rather than practically. The normal response to being told that your leg may need to be amputated, that your career may be over, that the thing you have built your life around may no longer be available to you, is grief. It is fear. It is the long and difficult work of adjusting to a reality that is different from the one you had planned for. Doohan appears to have skipped directly to the part where you figure out what comes next. Not because the other part didn't exist, but because the other part was not useful, and useful was the category he was operating in. 5 World Championships. A thumb on the handlebar where a foot used to be, a leg that the doctors had discussed removing, still carrying him forward. That is the story of Mick Doohan. It is not a comfortable story in the way that sporting stories are sometimes supposed to be comfortable. It doesn't resolve into something simple. It just keeps going forward, practical and relentless, and completely indifferent to the idea that it was supposed to be impossible. Like the man himself, drop your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you watched Doohan race during those championship years. I want to hear what it was like to watch him in person. We'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.